Hi, mamas, and welcome back to the Knit Your Stress Away podcast. My name is Nadine Medina, and I am your host. And today I have a topic for you that I am hoping is super duper helpful as you are beginning your knitting journey. We're going to chat about the 5 essential tools that you need to start knitting today without overcomplicating it, because I know there's a lot out there and there's a lot of different brands and things. We're going to just condense it down to the 5 biggest things that you need in order to start knitting. So let's get started. Welcome to Knit Your Stress Away. Are you a mom who feels overwhelmed, craving a creative outlet, but unsure where to start or how to fit it into your already packed day? I have dedicated this podcast to help you discover practical, guilt-free self-care strategies through the calming practice of knitting. I'll help you break free from the overwhelm, quiet the noise and comparison of social media, empowering you to pick up your knitting needles instead and embrace moments of rest, creativity, and mindfulness. Hi, I'm Nadine, a mom, wife, and passionate knitter. I first learned to knit as a teenager from my grandmother back in Germany, but for some reason, I put my needles down in my 20s. It wasn't until 2020, when everyone was searching for ways to ease the anxiety of the unknown, that I picked knitting back up, and something amazing happened. I found peace and joy in the cozy, calming rhythm of knitting, and now I'm so excited to share my practical tips and habits with you so you can reclaim your time, recharge, and rediscover the things that bring you happiness. It's time to ditch the endless scroll on social media and focus on what truly matters, your well-being. So if you're ready to take control of your stress, ditch overwhelm and social media comparison, rekindle your creativity, and recharge with a hobby you love, this podcast will guide you every step of the way. Take a deep breath, grab your knitting needles, and let's start creating a life with less stress and more joy, one stitch at a time. Hey mamas, and welcome back to the podcast. Today I wanted to share a quick personal story and how that relates to knitting as well, of course, because it doesn't seem like it initially. But I just wanted to chat with you about taking time for yourself and the guilt that we feel that comes along with that. And first of all, I wanted to let you know that if that's you, if you are like, where in the world does my time go? Why in the heck do I not have any left for myself? I wanted to tell you that I see you and that I've definitely been there as well. And here or there, I still am. It's never something that completely, I feel like, goes away, but it's something that you can actively work with and work for to, feel better about and to get rid of that guilt. And I'm also pretty sure that if you're a little bit like me, you may have tried other like self-care things in your life before to, in order to kind of combat that guilt feeling where you're like, okay, I need to do something for myself. And whether that was yoga or maybe meditation or journaling or taking a walk or whatever. There are so many things out there that you can try, but maybe none of those have clicked for you and you are still battling that guilt because you just can't seem to sit down without having that nagging feeling of, okay, I should be doing the laundry. I should be doing the dishes. I should be playing with my kids. I should, right? For me, I did not realize, I did all those things, and some of them I actually do enjoy and I still do them. But when knitting came back into my life as a complete accident back in 2020, it was during the pandemic, I was like, oh my gosh, I need something. And I tried all the other things and it just wasn't really doing much. And I saw all these people sharing that they were knitting and they're knitting these beautiful things on Instagram. And I was like, wait a minute, I know how to do that. I have done this before. Why don't I try that? And it wasn't necessarily, I didn't pick them up, the needles. I didn't pick them up for the calming effect, but it was more like just for the joy that I was like, I think I remember liking it. But it had been so very long that I actually knitted. I wasn't even quite sure if I would still enjoy it. So I just gave it a try. And I really honestly had no idea the calming effect that it would have on me. And that came almost immediately. Like I had so much fun making my first project. I still don't recommend making that very same project. It was a very, very, very big cardigan knitted with cotton only. So it was taking a long time, not necessarily what I would recommend for a beginner, but this goes to show how much I actually enjoyed it because I finished that entire thing and it took me months to do. But I was just in the process, and that was something I didn't expect. So it's not necessarily always about the final product and wearing it and what it looks like. It's part of it, of course, because you're looking at it and you're like, wow, I can't wait to actually have that in my hand or on my head or around my neck, right? But it's also the joy of the process, that meditative feeling that you get when you knit, and when you sit down to actually pull out your project. And it's just such a fun hobby to have. And I talked about this in a previous episode where, we kind of talked about how knitting can create more time for you. And also, it helped me to really get rid of that guilt because I love doing it so much that I'm like, you know what? I do deserve doing this. I deserve doing something for myself that I love doing, that I enjoy. And it's okay if that means that there is a laundry basket still sitting there and I haven't gotten to it yet, because I will. I will be able to get to that when the time comes. But this time for me, that is filled with something that gives me joy and that is fun for me, is so much more important for my health, for my well-being, for my mental health, than having my entire house together at all times. And that is a huge, huge mindset switch. And if you're still finding yourself at that crossroads where you're like, I'm not sure if this is for me because, I just don't have the time for it, I have a quiz on my website that might be fun for you to take and actually find out if it's for you and if you're ready to get started. You can find it at thenittingmamas.com/quiz. And it's super short. It takes like 30 to 60 seconds. You just answer a couple questions and it'll spit out, are you ready or are you not ready? And if you're not ready, guess what? I have this fun freebie for you that you can download and that helps you actually work on this mindset shift of having this time for you that doesn't induce the feeling of guilt, for you to work on that. And also practical tips and strategies to actually find and create more time in your life so that you can imagine adding a hobby like knitting into your life. Because if you're listening to this podcast and you have been, and you have been listening to it this long now, then you probably are ready to knit and to learn how to knit or if you're already knitting, like to do it more, which is likely why you're listening to this podcast. But you might need a little bit help in the time department. So I got you covered there. If you are ready to knit and if you're like, yes, let me get started, well, today's episode is for you. So we are going to talk about the 5 simple tools that will make starting to knit a lot more simple. Obviously, there's tools that you need in order to get started. Like you can't knit without needles, but actually, I've seen people knit with their fingers, but it doesn't appeal to me one bit. So if you do that, tell me the secret, because it looks complicated to me. But here I am talking about knitting with needles and it not being complicated. So who knows? But let's get back to this. So 5 tools that you're going to need to make your start super easy, not complicated, and easy to integrate into your life. So you can find more than these 5 tools in my free checklist that you can also download at thenittingmamas.com/checklist. It has everything you need, including the links to each tool that I highly recommend, because obviously there's different brands and stores and places to get these things. So I have everything super easy laid out for you. All you need to do is click on it, make your purchase, grab your tools, and you'll be ready to go. Okay, so we're starting with tool number 1. Obviously, you will need good needles. And why is that important? So you can go to any craft store that you have in your city or town, and you can grab a pair of knitting needles, but they're not all made the same. And what you want to do is you want to get a good quality needle that isn't necessarily like the best needle out there either, because, what if you don't end up liking it? I mean, I hope not, but what if, right? Then you don't want to waste your money. But you do want to have a good pair. And my personal favorites are called circular needles. So the needles are connected by a cable in the middle. And And the reason why I prefer those is that the stitches that you have eventually on your needle and as you knit, they're going to slide down onto that little circle on the cable, and they're not going to weigh as heavy on the needle as they would if you had a straight needle, which is, you can't bend it. So it's just a straight needle, either made from bamboo, from some other type of wood, or from metal. And to me, it hurts my wrists too much. And, when you're new to this movement, to this motion of your hands, it can really kind of, mess with your wrists, and you just don't want that. So I highly recommend circular needles. And I also personally prefer the metal ones. We just had a discussion about this in our community, which, by the way, you can also join that for free if you want to hop on over in there. It's theknittingmamas.com/group, and it's hosted on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, you can join us there. But we just had a discussion about bamboo needles or metal needles, and we all have our different opinions and preferences. And of course, that's fine. Me personally, I would always recommend the aluminum or, metal needles, because I like for the stitches to smoothly move on the needle. Of course, the downside of that is the possibility of dropping stitches, because sometimes they move a little bit too smoothly, and then you might have that issue. But it's just something to kind of try out. But again, I have my recommendation in the free checklist that you can download. So I definitely wouldn't worry about getting too fancy. Pick a pair that is kind of like in the mid-range of the prices. I would probably say around $10 to $12 is a good reference, and try the circular needles. Even if you're knitting a flat piece, which is what you are most likely going to start with as a beginner, you can use circular needles. It does not matter. Okay. All right. Tool number 2, obviously, yarn. We need yarn in order to knit. But there's about 15 million different types of yarn out there. Which one do you need? Well, I would say get a yarn that is, number 1, not going to break the bank, and number 2, that is either chunky or bulky. And what does that mean? So it's not the super thin yarn like cotton, which is a very nice yarn, and I love it, and I love how it looks when you knit it up. But I say as a beginner, it's not the most ideal, because it takes quite a long time to knit with it, because it's just so thin. So it takes a long time, like a row is not very thick. And if you want to have a very quick win, I would say knit with something a little bit thicker than that. One of my favorite beginner yarns, and beyond, because I use this yarn all the time, is called You and Me by Lion Brand. And there is another one called Color Theory, also by Lion Brand. I'm going to put them in the in the show notes. The You and Me is a mix of wool and synthetic fibers. It is a little bit on the bulkier side. The Color Theory is a bit thinner. So if I had to choose one of the two for a beginner, I would go with a You and Me. And hue, like the color hue, right? So You and Me. Super affordable. It's like around $6 for one yarn ball, and that can get you far. I would probably, unless you have a very specific project in mind that you want to tackle and that you're ready for, start with just one ball and just practice with it. It's just so fun, right? Okay, tool number 3 is a needle. So you're going to, not a knitting needle, but you're going to need a tapestry needle or a darning needle, which is a little bit of a thicker sewing needle, usually with a blunt tip, because you don't really need them to be sharp. And this is so that you can, in the end, when you're done with your project, so that you can weave in the ends of the yarn. It does happen, like even if you were making something really small and you would never have to switch between 2 yarn balls because you're done with one, you will still have the beginning and you will have the end of your project that has little tails and that need to be English, Nadine, that need to be woven into the final project so that you can't see them in the end. Unless, of course, you're making like little tassels, then, they come in handy and they stay, but that's not often the case. So you will need one of those little needles in order to be able to weave in your ends. Tool number 4, you need a good pattern, like an easy to follow pattern. The thing with patterns is, if they're written well, they're pretty easy to follow and easy to understand. And a lot of designers do test calls so that they have a few people actually testing the patterns before they release them to the public, which helps them iron out any mistakes or anything that's kind of hard to understand. But if you're sticking with designers who do basic and very beginner-friendly patterns like Two of Wands or Whistle and Wool. Those are some of my favorites. They have amazingly written patterns. However, you will still need to learn a couple of, basic words and also abbreviations that are in each pattern. But oftentimes they actually have a little bit of a glossary in there where you don't have to look it up every time. So it's right there in your pattern, usually at the end or in the beginning, where it explains certain expressions or abbreviations right in the pattern, which I find so helpful. But of course, start with something smaller, like a loop scarf, which doesn't need to be knitted in the loop. So you want to look out for a scarf that is knitted flat, and then in the end, you're going to sew it together, which is another reason why you're going to need that sewing needle. You can look for just a scarf that you tie around your neck. So that's another one that's just a rectangle. You can also make shirts or sweaters. They can be very, very simple as well and not overwhelming for a beginner because they are made from panels that are just knitted rectangles or sometimes squares. It depends on, of course, the shape of the final product. But even the sleeves are just a rectangle that you then loop around, sew together, and then sew to the body. And for all of that, there are tons of videos out on YouTube as well. The fifth tool that I highly recommend is, and I had to go back and forth because there are just some very helpful tools out there. I was going back and forth between a gauge measuring tool and a road tracker. So I'm just going to talk about both of them really quickly. So really, we have a bonus tool here today, which is not a bad thing. So you need a road tracker. You need a way to track your rows as you knit your project. It seems like a small detail, but keeping track of your rows, it's sort of a big deal. So, but there's many different ways to do it. And I actually had a Knit and Tell Friday episode on exactly this because I have a new favorite way to do this, and it's called the Knit and Note app, where you can load your pattern in. It's a free app. So there's a paid version, but there's also a free version, which is what I'm using. You can load up your pattern, upload your pattern. And then when you go into the pattern and you start this pattern and this project, you can add a little row counter and you can just click as you go through the rows. Another really cool way is just to print your pattern out and just use tally marks. And you can just make lines as you go through your rows. Gauge measuring tool, I guess that is the bonus tool that we're talking about, isn't necessary 100%. It is necessary, in my opinion, to knit a gauge swatch before you actually start your project. All of this is explained in the pattern, how many rows and how many stitches you need to knit in order to meet the gauge. And there's many, many videos to talk about why this is important. We actually have one in the group as well. And then usually the measure for a swatch for your gauge is 4 inches by 4 inches. That's the kind of a standard measurement. So obviously you can just use a measuring tape and just manually measure it, or you can get yourself a gauge measuring tool, which is a helpful investment, in my opinion. That is just looking like a little square with a 4 by 4 inch opening, and you just place this entire measuring thing. It's like a little ruler. That's a square. You place it over your gauge swatch, and then you can count your rows and stitches in that little square, and you can see if you match the gauge. A lot of these gauge measuring tools also have on the edge a bunch of holes which are used to measure your knitting needle size. Also very helpful. So it's basically 2-in-1. And inside of my free checklist, again, you can download that at theknittingmamas.com/checklist. You have all the links to all of these things that I just mentioned, including those are all my favorite ones and where I would buy it. So I'm literally sending you to this very specific gauge measuring tool on Amazon that I have personally in my house, and that's super affordable. I think it's like $7 or $8. So go get that list and get started on gathering your tools, build up the excitement. And I hope I see you over in our Facebook community. In fact, this coming Friday, the 15th of November at 1 p.m., we do have our next Knit and Chill Circle, which is a live gathering that we do on Zoom. And you can bring your tools, you can bring your project if you already started knitting. And if you're just kind of like, oh, I just want to check this out, I want to ask some questions, you're welcome to join us. I can't wait to see you over there. Hop over in the group, theknittingmamas.com/group, and I will talk to you guys all very soon. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me on today's episode. I hope you're walking away with a bit more inspiration and a few ideas to make your self-care a priority. If today's chat gave you a little boost, I'd love it if you could leave a 5-star review on iTunes. This helps other moms discover the podcast and start finding more calm and creativity in their day as well. And don't forget to join us over in the Knitting Mamas community on Facebook by going to theknittingmamas.com/group. Thanks again, and remember, you deserve time for yourself to recharge and feel your best. Catch you next time on the Knit the Stress Away podcast.